It's our great pleasure to complete the series tonight with this lecture by Fiona Mcgregor on the artist Cigdem Aydemir's photographic series, Extremist Activity. Cigdem is a contemporary artist and an MFA student at the Sydney College of the Arts and was the recipient of the Redlands Art Prize in 2012 as an emerging artist. Our speaker tonight, Fiona Mcgregor, is a writer and performance artist. She's published 5 books and numerous essays, articles and reviews. Fiona's Strange Museums, a travel memoir of a performance art tour through Poland, was published to critical acclaim in 2008, and her latest novel, which is a family saga titled Indelible Ink, was published by Scribe in 2010. This book won the Age Book of the Year and was also shortlisted for the Indie Book Awards, the Barbara Jeffress Award and the WA Premiers Award. Fiona has also been making performance art for about 15 years. Her performance includes both video and live actions, including You Have the Body, a meditation on unlawful detention, which toured in 2008 and 2009. Fiona's doctoral thesis on Sly Grog Criminal, Iris Webber, which sounds very exciting to me, will eventuate in 2 novels set in the 1930s and 1940s in Sydney. I'm looking forward to Fiona's insights on Cigdem's work tonight, which she will reflect through her own cultural upbringing, and we also welcome Cigdem here tonight. Thank you, Cigdem, for coming. Please give Fiona a warm welcome as she presents Donna Obscura, a look behind the veil of Cigdem Aydemir's extremist activity. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, and thanks to Cal for this very generous commission. And I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners. This image is a close-up of a performance called Site Occupied 2, and it's the first performance of Cigdem Aydemir's work that I came across. It was in Sexes, an exhibition at Performance Space in Carriageworks in 2012. The curators Deborah Kelly and Beck Dean had asked me to do a performative lecture, which involved taking an audience on a quirky sort of guided tour. There's me yapping in the front. So I visited the exhibition several times, witnessing this installation inhabited by the artist as well as empty. And in her absence, artificial eyes were placed in the aperture over the entrance. On the day I did my lecture, the artist was present, her eyes darting to and fro while we assembled below. As you can see, in order to access this corridor, we had to walk right into the artist's niqab, a multivalent move for me, into the womb of art, into the underworld, the subconscious, into the clandestine feminine realm, into another culture. In that sense, a very transgressive penetration, given this garment has come to represent Orthodox Muslim women. My God, we walked right between her legs. But the mischievous eyes and their alternative kitsch fake ones held us on the brink. And what I realised was that I had reacted in this way largely because I'm a Catholic. So this work was about me as much as the artist or garment or religion or culture she was invoking. And I could sense a variation in this unease, tempered with amusement in the audience that followed me in. So the niqab was a mirror. I'm calling myself a Catholic or nominating this as a relevant thing as part of an interrogation of my reaction, not to embark on a solipsistic appraisal of this work, but hopefully to open an aperture to reactions more broadly in our society, to the women who wear these garments. For Aydemir, rather, this is what the works are about, rather than Muslim specificity. The shadow of my religious childhood may give me as much distraction as insight. Its strictness is so unrecognisable today as to seem quaint, even cultish. However, its vestiges are everywhere. Look at our Prime Minister. So let's hope for insight. I wanted to go back and consider the veil as a garment, a timeless ancient garment, pragmatic in evolution, like any enduring form. It began in the same place as sheep, wheat, and the written word, a place that degraded into desert according to Jared Diamond through exhaustive agricultural practices. The veil, or scarf as we also might call it, was useful in this climate, offering protection against sun, wind, sand. It was worn in variation by all sexes across social strata, hundreds of years before the religions that emerged from here, Zoroastrian, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim. It was a useful, versatile garment, perhaps at night draped over one as a blanket, folded to a pillow, wrapped around one's belongings. The veil might be cousin to the turban and thrives millennia after millennia. So the tying of the veil is a choreography of culture, gender and caste. Aydemir is the daughter of a tailor, so she understands this, and the veil is her canvas. Instead of fixed white material, she works with mercurial black. She studied fashion design for 2 years before enrolling in art school, so she was artisan before artist. This is the corridor of site occupied 2. Fashion and dress and their attendant codes are intrinsic to this work. In this particular one, there is such an enormous quantity of fabric, I think about 80 metres. And subsequent to this exhibition, this swathe would be reinvented several times. Before I show you these works, I want to go back to a performance done in 2011 that Aydemir says paved the way for the Extremist Activity series. Hair/veil was done for video and, as such, carries the sense of a private ritual. It was shown as a video installation, and in it, Aydemir cuts her hair off and makes a veil from it, which is what you see on the podium in front. This performance seems acutely personal. The cutting of hair resonates across so many cultures, including first Australians, as an act of mourning, of leave-taking. But the creation of the veil from the artist's actual body, material, seems a restorative gesture. It's a binding gesture, and binding is an ambivalent thing. This work also seems to me more specifically Turkish, perhaps referencing the ban in Turkey on women wearing hijab in public. So Aydemir actually attaches this veil to herself at the end. This ban is decades old. It was altered in 2011 but not fully rescinded. And in response, many women tied their scarves tight to their heads and then pulled wigs over them. Aydemir's done another performance about that, but there's a little bit of resonance with this. So in enacting that gesture, these women at once obeyed and defied the rule. It's a very clever form of subversion. And I think that there's something similar going on in Aydemir's work. What is supposed to be covered becomes the covering. And the dance between revelation and concealment is constant. So understanding the veil as cross-cultural form, I often chafe at hearing it represented as other, because it is and it isn't. In this work, which I think is from 2004, Deborah Kelly, the aforementioned curator of sexes, recalled the veiled woman in Christian iconography to point to contemporary Islamophobia. Again, apologies for that quality. These were actually matchboxes, incendiary devices. I also employed the veil in a performance work done 10 years ago, or more specifically actually, the shroud, with my ex-duo Sen Voodoo. I have to say the shroud was more the work of my collaborator Anya Voyak than me. The war on terror had just begun. Troops were amassing in Iraq. The Taliban in Afghanistan was under the spotlight. So burqas in the Western media were very, very potent symbols of conflict and of the abuse of women's rights by Islamic extremists. As such, it was a very tricky totem for us to adopt, even though we were both Catholics. We wanted to avoid conflation with that, and They're inversions, in a sense, being white and translucent. We were pursuing an image of loss and mourning, feminine, but also depersonalised under the influence of Polish theatre director Tadeusz Kantor, who I will talk a little bit more about later. I am still a bit uneasy about imagery of the veil and my place with it, and it is partly why this work of Aydemir's is so powerful to me. Here's an image which is probably familiar to a lot of people here, and it is my first experience with veils. I went to Loreto Convent. But this order of nuns, Institute of the Blessed Virgin Mary, is like the Jesuits, and they emphasise education and social work, and it's such a quite progressive and feminist. So there was only one nun at my school still wearing this sort of habit. She was Irish and in her 80s. She was considered a relic, and she was mocked, and I'm a bit ashamed to remember that now. Throughout the 70s and 80s, Loreto nuns began scaling down to simple knee-length habits, bare arms and legs, perhaps a simple veil that left the neck visible. Now they were virtually no habit, just a little crucifix badge here. So there's no point me finding an image of a nun from Loreto because you wouldn't recognise her as such. Sartorial regulations for students involved a ban on makeup and jewellery, a minimum length of school uniform, not very well enforced because it was the 70s and 80s, but most sensibly of all, the rule to tie back hair over shoulder length. And it brings me to the other pragmatic origin of the veil, alluded to in this galvanising performance for Aydemir. The very common sense of tying back hair, which over millennia has become religious law. At the apex of this law structure is a man, while the socially sanctioned wearers of long hair are mostly women. Sikhs come to mind as an exception. And I also think of the regulation of hair within Judaism. I do apologise if it sounds like blanket statements. I'm just trying to draw some commonalities in. But why so much fuss over this stuff on our heads that keeps us warm? It's unwieldy, sensual, volatile hair. It's of the body and separate. It comes from flesh, but it isn't skin. It grows, but is dead and numb. It demands attention, encouraging vanity. Hide your hair to display your modesty. This is Site Occupied 1, the performance that preceded Site Occupied 2. Aydemir's work contains many contradictions. There's a tension between access and obstruction. Our penetration of Site Occupied 2 was imperative to movement through the exhibition. Come into my culture and to my sex, cross the line and take responsibility. This performance seemed to say the opposite. How can we experience a work of art when we can't even enter the gallery? Aydemir's niqab installation kept the audience on the outside, looking in. She used both a mannequin and herself. These conceptual space-bending practices, or situation aesthetics, could be called part of the legacy of the 1950s avant-garde. By interrogating the space in which art is presented, they involve the viewer in its making and interpretation. And they've often been best employed by artists from minorities. Some say they've become reified in this era of multicultural biennales, but Aydemir's work is fresh, and I think it's because it speaks from an Australian community that hasn't had a very big voice until now. She's claiming a space, occupying a site for an often beleaguered and vilified minority. I find the obstruction of the audience in Site Occupied 1 a much more uneasy position than Site Occupied 2. It pairs the work back to the central action of visual art, the gaze. Within these large sculptural forms, the most active elements are the eyes. They deflect the gaze. By activating the art object, Aydemir becomes subject and makes us look at ourselves. She gives power back to the woman in niqab who has total authority over the site. But can she herself be read as a site occupied? Is territory not just place but also bodies, particularly women's? And if so, who has colonised her? The powers that decree she don the veil or the powers that demand she remove it? The gaze of an art audience could be compared to the colonisers, rapacious, invasive, acquisitive, something to be repelled, or the traditional male gaze dominant in art discourse to this day, even if subverted by works such as these. The shifts in Aydemir's work keep me hopping about in a constant state of doubt, but it's precisely in that doubt, the shifting ground, that the work is really nailed. The rise in Islamophobia throughout this century is well documented. Here in Australia, women in hijab receive more abuse than any other Muslims. Most recently, an incident on a train was filmed on the phone of a person who intervened just last week. Islamophobia, especially the egregious notion of niqabs and burqas as security threats, was a central motivation for the Extreme Activity series. Aydemir wore hijab for 10 years until the age of 20, and when she removed it, she suddenly found anonymity. In that was both relief and loss. Not being of Arab heritage, she was not read as Muslim. She passed, just like a femme lesbian or a white Aborigine. Put on lipstick, grow your hair, and you won't get hassled anymore. In fact, people will feel so relaxed around you, they won't hide their bigotry about them, assuming you're one of us. So, having this great swathe of fabric, from side-occupied 1 and 2, feeling frustrated by her loss of identity and angry with the bigots, Aydemir performed some guerrilla actions. What a woman might smuggle beneath her burqa is excellent fodder for an artist's imagination. Often what's beneath Aydemir's is easily apprehended, which is part of the point. For Swing, done in 2012, the artist veiled a swing in a park, leaving the usual aperture for eyes, and what she seems to be doing is swinging. In outdoor settings exposed to the elements, the burqa becomes reactive, shaped by the external environment as much as by the internal. I didn't see this, but I can imagine how mesmerising the movement of it would have been, like a sail or waves. Infinitely variable, the body within tantalising, now here, now gone. She then veiled the giant onion in the children's playground adjacent. What better sight to foreground the essential playfulness of this work? And if she felt invisible and harassed, she sure found a strong response. Here I am. This is about 4 metres tall, this structure, I think, or 3. You got a problem with me? Dis my niqab, I dare you. Running through a lot of her work also is a preoccupation with architectural forms, how we dress sites, how we dress ourselves. In Swing and Mount, there's no attempt to hide what is beneath, the structure pressing through in the latter and clearly named in this, Mount. I think this is one of her funniest images, assuming a sort of gigantesque, even monstrous caricature of femininity, which is my interpretation, probably not Aydemir's. But when I look at works like this and my response to them, I think they are really all about the imagination and how we anthropomorphise, how I just did, applying the female form to an architectural structure, how gendered the world can become down to objects and machinery. Both works were done during the day, in the middle of the day, during the week, without council permission, in Prince Alfred Park, next to Central Station. Such spontaneity and bravery are really rare now, due largely to the tyranny of public health and safety regulation. Artists also tend to wait for funding, motivated by careerist motivations. They want invited audiences and critics. But there's a vocational urgency to these works that couldn't care less about that. It's the feeling and politics that count. They're not done for money or acclaim. They're only done because Aydemir had to claim that space. Looking at them now and hearing Donna's introduction as naming them as a photographic series, which they clearly are. This is how they speak to us now in this hall, how they will speak in a gallery or a book. But first and foremost, I do think of them as action and encounter. And I wonder about the experience of passers-by confronted with these enormous black cloth manifestations whose simple eye-hole stamps the entire structure, at once surreal and literal, larger than life and everyday, as something specifically Muslim and female. I think of Christo and Jean-Claude and their rap works, alerting us to the mystery of the everyday. We don't notice what's there until it's covered. Apparently a passerby did actually call up to Aydemir, "What are you doing? Are you trying to do a Christo?" And I also think of Tadeusz Kantor, who I mentioned before, Polish theatre director and scenery designer who cut his teeth in the political cauldron of Poland before the Second World War, worked through that inferno, then decades of communist rule and martial law. Kantor's emballage or wrapping began in 1956. He wrapped his actors as well as parts of the set in dark cloth. I quote from his manifesto. "I was looking for systems that were artificial, that is, systems that had a chance to become autonomous. One needs to eliminate certain parts of an object, erase and make them invisible so as to be aware and be conscious of them. These principles were well known to the old masters. Emballage, when we want to shelter and protect, to preserve, to escape the passage of time. Emballage, when we want to hide something deeply. A huge black emballage is the final and radical complete tool of extermination." Kantor applied his philosophy of wrapping to other art forms. Around the time he began emballage, he also began attaching umbrellas to canvases, describing this move as a day of liberation through blasphemy. The sort of blasphemy Kantor was referring to was artistic blasphemy, the umbrella being such a utilitarian object, substituting for the supposedly sacred object of artistic practices. He wasn't trying to elevate a ready-made to an art object like Duchamp, but to reveal the function of the umbrella. Nor would he have used the word blaspheme without a Catholic sense of heresy and law-breaking, the way that I've thought of it in relation to this work. At work in his theatre is not just depersonalisation and desubjectification, but, according to Kantor scholar Michał Kobiałka, also deterritorialisation. Kantor's emballage erased the individual in the context of political crisis, but they also highlighted what lay beneath. And I see resonances with the woman in niqab, one of today's most potent representations of femininity. Through being hidden, she has been put under a spotlight. The public setting of these works makes elements of chance and risk central. This is called Stroll, done in 2011. It's another guerrilla-style performance with that same sense of urgency. Art as encounter is so opposite to the niqab. That's how it exists in life. In these three ambulant works, focused on social interaction, the veiled woman gets in and amongst it. Stroll took place on King Street, and it's an interesting site to conduct such an intervention, being a hipster and queer epicentre with a rich multicultural history. An inventory of Aydemir's audience on her stroll along King Street in her umbrellaed burqa might yield 6 different religions, 5 sexual orientations, 4 genders, ages from 0 to 90, scores of nationalities. It's a work that more than any other might point to the paradox of our time and place, how we can practice a variety of beliefs and lifestyles in this city, especially in Newtown. But barely a kilometre away, in 2010, a mural was painted of a woman's veiled face with a red cross through it, and the words "ban the burqa." This mural was incendiary to Aydemir, and a big reason she did these works. She tried to have it removed under the anti-discrimination law, but the law deals on the basis of race, not religion. It has been altered. This is the altered version. It now says "say no to burqas," and this is the artist. And the reason it can't be removed is that it's on his wall. He's a shopkeeper on King Street called Serge Redegali. I think it's interesting to note that the loudest voices against hijab and niqab are non-Muslim males, certainly here, and we are talking about Australian responses. I don't think the non-Muslim man is acting with feminist intent. I think he's boosting his sense of cultural superiority, as well as engaging in a sort of macho competition. What an affront for this woman to refuse him access. One of the most routine forms of male domination is the presumption with which men look at women. If you look at them with the same presumption, they literally rear back in surprise. I invite any woman here to experiment tomorrow on the street. They construe you as aggressive, and perhaps you are. Indeed, they often respond to you in kind, so you don't dare look back at them like that in case you inflame them. Every woman on the planet experiences this low-level regulation, which at its worst escalates to fear, even on King Street in progressive Sydney. Most of all, by casting blame elsewhere, the anti-veil man, non-Muslim man, abnegates responsibility for the gender inequality in his own backyard, in his very own home that he benefits from. But women are upset by veils too, and this is a much more difficult place. They can be upset by veils as much because they're feminists as because they deny feminism. The woman in niqab is often read as an avatar of misogynistic oppression. Being a woman, seemingly passive, she's easier to criticise than husband, boss, institution. Whichever way the woman is to blame, your veil is too long, your skirt is too short. But there's more. I have to stick my neck out and say that I'm uncomfortable with them, not hijab, but niqabs. And that's another reason I wanted to talk about this work. I find it funny and absurd and friendly, but that it triggers something in me. There's a chain reaction that leads to this node of grief and rage formed by my strict Catholic upbringing. The assumption of submission that was applied to my gender, the abhorrence of my body, the vilification of my sexuality. Of course, these lessons are imparted to girls everywhere by many cultures, even non-religious. But with a pious imperative and centuries of tradition attached, they're far more harsh and unyielding. The node got fed in adulthood by wider concerns of mine, the legacy of violence over millennia enacted in the name of all organised religions against the usual suspects, women, queers, Indigenous people. I use the term religion broadly. But look, I've gone off on this big tangent. I've been triggered. So I do read niqabs as oppressive to women, and it might be ignorant of me. It's the covered face that disconcerts me. It makes questions fly through my mind. Why must we cover ourselves? Or they cover themselves if they don't want to. Why can't they reveal their individual selves in public as men do, for reasons of modesty and its half-sister shame? But what bodily thing must we be ashamed of? What gives men the right to determine what we wear? But then I have to remember that I can repudiate my religious culture far more easily because it's dominant. And part of the reason I do repudiate it is because it is too powerful. The white middle-class hegemony even dominates feminist discourse. This work by Iranian artist Ghazal, actually showed to me by Aydemir, could be a witty riposte to this, or it could be a sincere desire. And then, is support for this cultural practice just merely mouthed? Is it effective? Is it just as effective a form of marginalisation? What British Muslim Yasmin Alabai Brown calls indolent acceptance, even racist disengagement of non-Muslim views, that niqabs are the choice of women who wear them. Aydemir insists on women's right to wear whatever they choose, and I do too. But how much choice do women have? That's the question that torments me. I don't see it answered by these works, and I think that is what adds to their strength. This is another one of the guerrilla, ambulant, or wheeled, actually, performances on King Street. The mysterious space beneath the burqa opens up again, and into the Donna Obscura the audience goes, becoming part of the performance. The role of rickshaw driver extends the ambiguity of the veiled woman. On the one hand, she's servile, doing a job associated with colonial overlords. On the other, she's at the helm, driving. It's a one-on-one performance as well as a public spectacle. Without that intimate, inaccessible conference, it would just be a visual gag. What happened inside that black box burqa? It's the camera obscura within which the piece is formed. Shop banalises the niqab and extends the joke on the conflation of criminality in Islam. It looks like maybe a petrol station supermarket, I don't know. So here she is, an everyday consumer, just like us, with mouths to feed. But why is she hiding her purchases? Is she a thief, or is it a protective gesture? Apparently this performance was the most difficult to do. The artist and her team were turned away from places, and when they tried to enter a shopping centre in Leichhardt, the security guard prevented them in case she had something hidden beneath her burqa. In the complex responses we have to niqabs and burqas, there's also consideration of the mask that has occurred to me. The covered Muslim woman certainly threatens in Judeo-Christian cultures because she is other. But I also wonder if our fear of her comes from something more than just xenophobia. Does it tap into atavistic fears of the mask? Across all cultures, human beings communicate with their faces. In person, facial expression is intrinsic to verbal and often precedes it. The most potent identifier is the face. The mask signals transformation or disguise, the abnegation of self. For millennia, masks have been worn in rituals to signal escape from the everyday and descent into the illicit, sometimes nefarious. Yet in getting to know a mask and its wearer's deeds, we lose our fear of it. This is Ned Kelly. I'm sure we all know that now. If we'd looked at that 100 years ago, we probably would have been very afraid. But this is an individual. More interesting are masks of practical purpose that can menace for the simple reason that we cannot see who is there. The individual has been erased. There is no personality. But am I deducing that because I live in a fear-driven society where a balaclava speaks more of banditry than of blizzards? The void inside the niqab is an endlessly articulate silence, but here it becomes sound. Into the void we project our desires and fears, a pliant, pious, childbearing wife, an oil oligarch's concubine lavishly made up, dripping with jewels, a religion, an ideology intent on our destruction, incendiary devices used to further that. Aydemir has stuffed this void with more things than you can poke a stick at. I wanted to show a video of this, and in fact, Aydemir gave it to me, but it didn't work, so I'm just going to show you a couple of images of the first place it was done at Alaska Projects in 2013. You can see that she's got balloons beneath her burqa. It might be coincidental that this gallery is in a car park, but the generic, austere and slightly sinister setting supports the concept in my mind. What she does, and she did this performance again last week at MCA's Art Bar, is blows up the balloons. And seeing it live, the focus was much more on the effort of the breath. The balloons, once all blown up, are all popped in a climax of what sounds like gunfire. And the woman in the niqab dodges and morphs. Heavy rhetoric aside, it's so funny, this series. It's characterised by wit and lightness of touch. Imminent is a challenge to paradigms of beauty. If the veiled woman points to the male gaze, what does the unveiled woman do? Is the latter just as policed and regulated? For centuries in Western culture, the ideal woman has been Aryan. Whilst body shapes and disclosure of flesh have varied according to era, beauty for centuries has been blonde and white. Bombshell inverts Marilyn over the subway in the iconic scene from the 7-Year Itch. This is also a video. Everything is opposite. The sky is dark and stormy, not blue. The legs revealed when the niqab billows are covered, not bare. Yet there is still a frisson in their appearance. There's no peaches and cream complexion raised in ecstasy, no luscious red lips, no blonde hair tossed carefree. But hey, she might be blonde underneath. Who said Muslim women couldn't be blonde? Another work tackling the beauty myth was done in Kandos, 4 hours drive west of Sydney, for the Cementa Festival in 2013. Again, the everyday is reinvented. A hairdresser's cape becomes a burqa. The Muslim woman is bookended by a vampy blonde, doubling the restriction. She looks cranky. I think that this work sets up a much more interesting juxtaposition than the city pieces, given the absence of a Muslim community in the town of Kandos. There is a little video online where you can watch the reaction to this work. And I think it really taps into curiosity about Muslim women and what they wear under their burqas in terms of their toilette, their makeup. You know, did you know nose jobs are really popular in Iran? Really? Yeah, there was an article in the Good Weekend. God, why would you get a nose job if you can't show it? That kind of ignorance, and it's voyeurism, really. So the question of disclosure is behind all these works. Curiosity tips into voyeurism, and there is no clear line. The works speak through silence. Even in the most declarative swing and mount, there is a sense of privacy, however. And I feel that in interrogating this work for this talk, I'm butting up against that privacy. The question of how these performances would be read in Auburn or Kuala Lumpur or Tehran butts up against it as well. I get a sense of multiple discourses. Some is taking place with all of us here in Sydney, in the parks, on King Street, in here tonight. Some of the discourse takes place in the community of women. And some, I'm sure, within the Muslim community, which I have no business overhearing. I want to thank Cigdem for these works. They have enlightened me. I think they're angry and generous in equal measure, which is a really rare combination. And after spending so much time with them, I think my relationship with the woman in niqab has changed. I'm not as afraid as I once was. And the future of Australian art is in very good hands. Thank you.